In our study of the synthesis of yoga, we are in the middle of the chapter titled The Soul and Its Nature. In this, Sri Aurobindo, the chapter titled The Soul and Its Liberation. In this, Sri Aurobindo is describing the relationship between the individual soul, nature, and God. We have seen in the discussion of the last couple of sessions the place of the individual and its immense importance to this whole creation. To summarize some key ideas, he says, this individual being of ours is that by which ignorance is possible to self-conscious mind. It is that also that by which liberation into the spiritual being is possible and enjoyment of divine immortality. And here the idea is something so precious, so profound. If there was not an individual, then the whole of the universe would be the individual. And the whole universe would be at any given moment in a state, either a state of complete ignorance, or if it is evolving, the whole universe would awaken to some spiritual consciousness of liberation, or some sense of immortality, or whatever it is. But the entire universe would be always in the same. The fact of an individuality makes possible that one individual can experience ignorance while another individual can experience the spiritual liberation and another can experience all the variations of experience in between or of these different states. In other words, because there is individuality, there can be an infinite possibilities of experiences simultaneously. Not only these experiences can be present simultaneously, but we can have the added experience of these different experiences meeting and discovering how they relate to each other. And now you look at the whole universe from this perspective. The place of the individual is so precious. It means there can be the individual experience of the flower, which is a semi-conscious form of life. And there can be this individual experience of the bee, which is another semi-conscious form of life that comes and relates in different ways to the flower. And there can be this gardener who is a more conscious form of life who can observe these two and as a scientist analyze what is happening in their relationship, or as an artist enjoy the beauty of their relationship, or as a gardener choose to assist in their relationship from a different experience of consciousness of these two. And you can see the complexity of relationships between these three, and into that throw in other possible experiences. An individual who lives in a liberated spiritual consciousness now entering this and adding to the joy and complexity of their play. And each one of the simultaneous experiences in the whole cosmos coming in relation to these and adding their own richness into it. And that's what makes for this extraordinary universe. The place of the individual, therefore, is so important to allow for simultaneous different experiences and their interplay. So when we criticize the fact that, oh, I am a limited individual, we have to appreciate the gift that it brings to us. That in a limited individuality, you can not only experience the growth into unlimited universality, but at the same time allowing for other experiences of growth in completely different lines. So even assuming every human being here is meant to, or is on the journey of some awakening to a liberated spiritual consciousness, it allows for each one of us to experience the journey differently, to approach the liberated spiritual consciousness from a different starting point, to experience it from a different angle or perspective or emphasis, and for each one of us further to remain in relation with each other in our journey, nourishing each other from our different perspectives, to allow for an eventual all multifaceted, infinite multifaceted realization shared across so many different individuals. And even in a liberated spiritual consciousness, to continue to learn from each other of these infinite possibilities. So the place of the individual is so precious. And nature is that backdrop in which the individuals can coexist, each as if affirming its own uniqueness, asserting its own independence from others, so as to be able to experience what they wish to be differently and independently of others who wish to be something else. And so at the very core of this individualization is the push to separate yourself from others, from the whole universe, from nature, and affirm your independence of nature, your independence from others, and independence even from the divine who manifests, pours out to become this nature and this individual. And if you see this first movement of asserting your independence, what do you see there? What a strong ego center. The very nature of the ego center is to define itself in terms of separateness, assert its independence, and then turn upon everything else from a poise of independence. If there was not this strong egocentric beginning, the individuality could never fulfill what it is meant to be. On the other hand, having affirmed its individuality, formed a distinct ego center, the ego feels itself so limited, so helpless, so incapable, that it begins now to reach out, to grow, to develop itself, to find its own truth, and eventually recover its own liberated consciousness and its own universality. And when it does that, it outgrows its narrow limits, experiences itself one with the whole universe, with the true center, the true person coming forward, and still allowing for a unique experience of this person, separate from the unique experience of that person, while each enjoys the full universality. When you look at the universe in this way, or you see the future of the universe, let's say each one of us in our growth, in our unique line of development and spiritual awakening and growth, each one of us attains to his or her universality, we would still be unique in our individuality that is universal. And we would still relate to each other to nourish, learn and grow from each other. Except now, because the ego sense has gone, we would know each other as complementary or even part of each other, knowing the same one in each, but differently in each, expressing something distinct and unique in each, while being still part of the oneness that is the whole, and while being each one still the same one divine. So this is the direction in which Sri Aurobindo is taking this discussion of individuality. The individual sage who sits on the top of a mountain or in his cave, in order to extinguish his consciousness, is able to enter extinction while his next door neighbor in the next cave may be entering a very different experience, while the other individuals at the foot of the mountain are entering a different experience, because individuality is possible. Now, keeping this background in mind, the next discussion which he takes up will be something extremely profound. I'll come to that shortly, but the idea there is that to allow for these different experiences, the individuality must affirm its separateness. The moment it begins to affirm its separateness and seeks to realize the spiritual oneness, the experience of oneness is somehow flawed and leads to certain very contradictory or different philosophies or religious positions, which he will be describing, and then releasing from their limitation to give you this grand vision of unity. In the portion we read last time, Sri Aurobindo referred to these three powers: God, nature, and the individual self, whose eternal unity and intimate necessity to each other we have to realize in order to understand the nature of existence and resolve the puzzle of the appearance of the world. When, he says, we achieve true self-knowledge, when we get back to our true being, the ego falls away from us, that is that sense of separateness. Its place is taken by our supreme and integral self, the true individuality. And this Supreme Self experiences itself one with all beings, sees all world and nature in its own infinity. The sense of separateness has gone. The consciousness in which we live is without limits, without division, infinite, no longer separate from anything or anyone in the universe. And it is this poise, he says, which the ancients referred to as non-birth or destruction of birth. No more the sense of separate birth or the separateness. While we still continue to act through this individual focus of the personality that we have, the mind, the body, those have not gone. Although our consciousness is freed, we act through this focus, but with a very different experience and a very different knowledge. He says in the last sentences that we read, the world also continues, but we see it in our own being and not as something external to it other than ourselves. To be able to live permanently in this new consciousness of our real, our integral being, is to attain liberation and enjoy immortality. In this consciousness, not only you are liberated from all limitations, not only are you free to act without any conditioning, while still remaining an individual and with an individual focus of action, but you do not experience any sense of personal reduction or loss or limitation in birth or death. And so the experience of immortality in an individual, with an individual focus, while your next door neighbor might still experience the opposite consciousness of limitation, ego, birth and death. Now this is possible because of the importance of the individual, and now we understand the nature of the true individuality, the integral or individual, liberated, coming forward to replace ego. Now, having gone through this so far, Sri Aurobindo takes up a very important, very detailed description of what happens when we approach this realization or liberation from a limited origin or a mind-focused consciousness. How it has led to certain extreme and sometimes even contradictory philosophical and religious distinctions. This discussion spans across 4 paragraphs. And since we will not have time to cover it in one session, I will summarize what is in each of these and the line of argument that he goes through. It's somewhat detailed in its philosophical articulation, but the conclusion of that, which we will jump to at the end of the summary, takes up what he has just described. You live in a new consciousness. Your relationship with others and the world and God are changed. What is that like? And that he describes after these 4 paragraphs. So first he takes up in the first paragraph of these 4, he says, here there comes in the complication of the idea that immortality is only possible after death, in other worlds, on higher planes of consciousness, or that liberation should destroy all separate mental bodily living and annihilate the individual forever into impersonal infinity. This is the idea you will find in certain Vedantic traditions, Advaita Vedantic as it is today, and the Buddhist traditions, and various very specific schools or religions around the world. Innate to this is the idea that somehow just having a mind or a body binds you and limits you. In particular, he says, death is the king of the material world, and so for life to exist here, it has to submit to death, and through constant dying, you have continuity of life. So anything which submits to the physical world and physical body existence, therefore is limited by the death experience and is not truly free. And in order to get to the true freedom and liberation, one has to get out of the physical world and body and even mind, which brings with it in ignorance and limitation. There are even those, he says, who would want to go beyond even the idea of immortality. In certain traditions where the absolute is the goal, even immortality in some higher plane of consciousness, well, that's a limited experience. You should get to the absolute. And how do you get to that? Through an impersonality, by a dissolution into the absolute or the infinite or the impersonal. And Sri Aurobindo explains that it appears to be so. It appears to be so because that is the relationship that the individual Purusha has set with his own nature. And this is the key to our understanding. Why does the person who has experienced that higher state of consciousness declare that you should get free of the body and mind if you really want to have the liberation? Because that was the relationship set by the individual consciousness inhabiting mind and body, which gave to it this appearance. And he'll explain this shortly. He says, the reason why we experience the world, the cause of our world existence, is not as our present experience induces us to believe, the ego. Rather, ego is a result of a particular way in which we are experiencing the world. So we are now in the second paragraph of that very intricate logic, summarizing it. He says, in many of these traditions, the idea is that because you have an ego, you experience the world. If you got rid of the ego, you would cease to experience the world. At least that's the philosophy. And he's going to show you that that is not true. In fact, he says, because of a particular way in which we experience the world, we experience ego. But world would continue to be irrespective of it. It is the relation which the many-souled Purusha has set up between individualized minds and bodies, a relation of self-defense, of mutual exclusion and aggression, in order to have among all the dependence of things in the world upon each other, a possibility of independent mental and physical experience. So this is the relationship set of all the individuals. If I want to experience my mind as separate from all other minds, if I want to experience my body as separate from all, how is that possible? in fact my body is tied to everything else, the food I eat, and those bodies of the vegetables or the animals, or themselves emerging from other bodies and their waste. You cannot separate your bodily existence from the rest of the bodily existence, not just of the universe, but even individuals of the universe. So too, your mind experience cannot really be separate from others, because all the time your thoughts are being shared with others. Unconsciously mostly, but even consciously. Even the fact that you interact with an animal, a dog, cat, horse, they are receiving your thought impressions, your thought ideas. You can be passing by, they look at you and they receive an imprint of your thought. If you're riding the horse, the image you form, the horse catches and either accepts or rejects. And so, to experience a separateness of one being from another in thought, what is necessary? An aggressive pushback to exclude everything else from you. And this is the beginning of that ego sense. You have chosen to set up this aggressive pushback. And that's why he says, you don't experience the world because you have an ego. Rather, ego is a manner of experiencing the world, setting up this aggression to insulate yourself. Now you see, the logical conclusion of this is a brilliant insight he gives you. When the ego thus tries to affirm its separateness, how does it do it? If I have to exist independent of everyone else, I have to exist independent not only of other people, I have to exist independent of the universe, the whole world. I have to exist independent of God. How do you do that? By kind of blotting out of all these things. By kind of separating yourself until they cease to have any meaning for you. And this is the direction in which that liberation takes, because it began from this egocentric self-affirmation. The ascetic in his cave, while he seeks to realize his liberation, is trying to realize his liberation still in this aggression of mutual exclusion, my liberation, in which therefore nothing else should bother or come into the picture. So Sri Aurobindo says, it ceases to admit them, others, relations with others and God, because by admitting them, it becomes dependent on them. It ceases to admit its own persistence, because the persistence of ego means admissions of that which it tries to exclude as not self, of the cosmos and other beings. So even it has to say, my own ego is not permanent if I have to be liberated. Because if you accept your ego is permanent, everything else also has a permanence. So you want to be free of everyone else, you want to be free of God, you want to be free of your own ego sense or a separate individuality. How can you do that? By kind of blurring out. So, the self-annihilation of the Buddhist is in its nature absolute exclusion of all that the mental being perceives. So what did you do in the process? You excluded everything until everything else ceased to be, and that becomes the state of annihilation. I have extinguished myself in the very act of excluding everything else from me. It's actually an exercise of exclusion. And at the same time, the Advaitin, who gives a different approach, who says that I immerse myself in the one, he says, Sri Aurobindo says, the self-immersion of the Advaitin in his absolute being is the self-same aim, differently conceived. What have you done in immersion in the absolute being is you have annihilated by an absolute exclusion everything. So there are just two different ways of approaching this exclusion. Both are a supreme self-assertion of the soul on its exclusive independence of Prakriti. I exist independent of all this reality, and I therefore dissolve everything, separating myself, or immerse into the one, but by that also dissolve everything. If you think about it, in the very core of these very high and profound experiences is the fulfillment of what the ego was trying to do, become independent of everything. And this, because we started from the ego sense, defining ourselves by exclusion. And this is the profound insight which will now lead us to a very different view. In the original movement of liberation, which was arrived by a shortcut, by withdrawal, by dissolution of all other separateness, he says, when we break out from ego, the physical mind, into the infinite of the spirit, we still see the world and others as the mind has accustomed us to see them, as names and forms. Only in our new experience of the direct and superior reality of spirit, they lose that direct objective reality. So you remember we started in the ego consciousness that said, this is different, that is different, this is named this is a form of that. Now when you enter into the higher spiritual consciousness, you continue to maintain the habit of the mind's seeing, this is this, this is this, this is this. Except that now it's no more true from a spiritual consciousness. So all you have done is you have lost their objective reality. And our mentality, stilled and different, no longer strives to know and make real to itself those terms which exist in them as in us. The terms which are intermediate terms, the terms by which we perceive and know things. Now all those things have faded out because your mind has become still in this liberated consciousness. Now you don't try to see from a new and deeper insight, because it doesn't matter. It's become almost ephemeral, almost unreal. We are satisfied with the blissful, infinite impersonality of a pure spiritual existence. Nothing else and nobody else any longer matters to us. What the physical senses show to us and what the mind perceives and conceives about them so imperfectly and transiently delights in, seems now unreal and worthless. So now what would have normally happened if the mind was still accepted as a valid part of the spiritual experience? The mind, from a heightened spiritual insight, would begin to now re-engage with these terms from a new poise. It does not, because it's no more interesting, it's no more necessary. While from the spiritual poise, the way you saw through mind earlier is not correct, it's not true, or it's false, or it's unreal. So what do? The whole thing begins to fade out, blur out, and you separate in exclusion. And therefore, he says, we no longer share in God's delight in the world. On the contrary, it looks to us as if the eternal had degraded itself by admitting into the purity of its being the gross nature of matter. Or he has falsified truth by accepting this ignorance of matter. That's how it appears. You see the brilliance of that logic. Where the error came was that we started from the mind's way of valuing things, entered into a spiritual consciousness where those values were no more relevant, but now entering into the spiritual consciousness, the mind is stilled and is no more trying to see more deeply. And the spiritual consciousness no more accepts those earlier ways of looking at things. And so everything appears to be somehow inferior, degraded. And the way he will show how to do it differently, where you will see the fulfillment and the deeper sense of these things, that will come later. But meanwhile, we no longer share in God's delight. Or else, we perceive, if we perceive at all that delight, it is with a far-off detachment which prevents us from participating in it with any sense of intimate possession. So this yogi from the cave lives in a exalted delight, but when he engages with the world, he says the delight is in God. In the world, somehow, it doesn't matter. Or when he comes back from that exalted state, suddenly the world is even more barren, pointless, and dark. But what's the correction? And in the next paragraph, Sri Aurobindo shows us we could have approached the whole thing differently. If in the process of the yoga, in our process of return to our realized being, turning upon the world, freely repossessing Prakriti, we become conscious not only of the bodies and outward self-expression of others, but intimately of their inner being, their minds, their souls, and that in them of which their own surface minds are not aware. Then we see the real being in them, and we see them as selves of ourself and not as mere names and forms. You see, in that movement of awakening into the spiritual consciousness, and from there turning to look at the world, if you don't stop with the surface appearance the way the mind saw, if you start looking deeper and experiencing things the way people experience in themselves, not as you saw, then suddenly we discover that the things within them are identical or one with the things within us. So let's stop for a moment again. We take this beautiful flower. In my mind consciousness, it's just name called lotus, form of some molecules or whatever else. And as I enter into my deeper, higher, exalted state, I say, well, it's just form of matter, fading away, becoming irrelevant. And I assert my independence of all nature, and this also becomes not me, not I, fades away. And in my higher delight, what is this form? Just a blurred, superficial, trivial, illusory thing to be discarded, or a form of ignorance. Hang on, while I'm having this experience, if my next door yogi is having the same experience and he looks at me, he says my form is trivial, irrelevant. I look at him and I say his form is trivial and irrelevant, while we both are in our state of bliss. So something is wrong there, isn't it? The error was when I looked at the other yogi in my next door cave, I saw only his body and his surface appearance. I did not feel his mind and his inner ranges, of which even he may not be conscious yet, or his soul. And while he immerses himself in his soul, he does not experience my inner ranges of mind or my soul. He looks at me also as body. So while in my immersion in bliss, I say this is trivial and all this has to fade away, including my next door yogi, he enters immersion and says, I am trivial and have to fade away. Something is wrong. In our little bubble of the individuality awakened into divinity, we have cut ourselves off from the truth of deeper divinity in all things. This is the reason why those philosophies came, those perspectives, and they are justified from this angle, but they are not the complete truth. And so he says, if in the course of our yoga we have turned to perceive things more deeply, or if from the first movement of separation into an exclusive inner focus we have reached a higher state, and then we turn now to gaze upon the world and we make effort to look more deeply, we become conscious not only of the bodies and outward self-expression of others, but intimately of their inner being, their minds, their souls, and that in them of which their own surface mind is not aware. So as I gaze upon this person, I see while he's thinking all this, inside him there are deeper layers where there are other motivations, other impulses, deeper aspirations he is not conscious of. And I can say to him, you know what, right now you're obsessed with this, but this is not going to satisfy you. Deeper within you, is something else that is pushing forward, that seeks a deeper realization, that seeks a deeper fulfillment. So when the mother met people, she would plunge straight into them and draw out that deeper presence, soul, and they would come away. Suddenly their whole worldview has changed. There's a complete reversal of their consciousness. And what is this? And for a while initially they're stunned because the mind is unable to hold or contain, and often for a few days, and then the experience fades away. They come back to their normalcy. But that brief glimpse has given them an insight. All that I was looking for is no more interesting. What do I do now? What do I seek? Or sometimes less dramatically, she would look more deeply and suggest or nudge or push something. Give them a deeper or longer term direction. But the person himself may not be conscious of it, which now you can glimpse because from a deeper consciousness. So looking at this beautiful flower, I would not say it's just lotus and a form of matter. I would see deeper within it the struggle of the life energy working to express the mind consciousness, which is organized and holds a certain sense of direction of its growth, and the intimate, deep psychic presence of which this flower is a special expression. And seeing all these, I would not discard it anymore, but something else would happen. He says, then we see the real being in them also, and we see them as selves of ourself and not as mere names and forms. So as I experience the deeper soul of this, I realize or I experience it is the same, it is identical with my own deepest self. I look upon the other human being, let's say my next door neighbor in the cave, who is entering his own state of exalted spiritual liberation, and I see him as this soul entering this experience. And what is he? In a sense, the same self that is I. I look down at the foot of the mountain and these beings struggling in their ignorance, and I look in the deeper ranges and I find the same self working a different line of experience of growth and development. And so, no more mere names and forms. We see them as selves of ourself. They become to us realities of the eternal. Each one is an expression, and a unique expression and development of the same eternal self. Our minds are no longer subject to the delusion of trivial unworthiness. You see, that is what happened earlier when the spiritual consciousness was attained and the mind became still. All this world is so trivial, so unworthy, so undivine. Or the illusion of unreality. Oh, this world is like an ephemeral surface ripple on the wave of the ocean. I am free, and the waves are irrelevant. In an ocean which is infinitely deep, how thick are the waves? Infinitesimally small compared to the infinity, and therefore practically unreal or non-existent. This also does not happen because now you realize they are waves of the same eternal reality that is I, as real as the self that is I. And now something extraordinary happens. If you have seen the material form of the lotus as expression of that life, deeper mind, soul, self, or each human body that earlier you trivialized as just a name and form, as an expression of the same one self, the material life loses indeed for us its old absorbing value, but finds the greater value which it has for the divine Purusha. Regarded no more as the sole term of our becoming, but as merely having a subordinate value in relation to the higher terms of mind and spirit, it increases by that diminution instead of losing its value. So what he's telling us now is actually the material form now will grow in value. Material life will become more precious, even more important. And he's explaining why. And he'll elaborate further. But what has happened is the old absorbing value of material life is lost. What was the old absorbing value? As my flower seller, this is going to gain me 20 rupees, by which I will eat my breakfast or feed my children, or over a few years gather enough money to have the sense of security of my own house, and then I will be happy. And that's all the flower means to me. It's an object. You remove it, replace it by some shiny new plastic toy which I sell, it's equivalent to the lotus. I don't see it different. Or even somebody who looks at it with some deeper value, still as a piece of art, as a beautiful subject of photography in which I can express its beauty, it still has a superficial physical value. Now when you look at it as conscious being, not only conscious being, the divine self expressing itself as this extraordinarily special and unique conscious being. And you see it now completely different value. What is your relationship to it? As I approach, first of all, it is sacred. It is a form of the divine. And I relate to it now in terms of the true relationship of the divinity within me with the divinity within it. And the physicality of it now has an added value. And he explains this. Regarded no longer as the sole term of becoming, but as merely having a subordinate value in relation to the higher terms of mind and spirit. Earlier, as I saw this, physicality was just the separate piece of reality. A part of the becoming of spirit. Spirit has somehow become matter, and that's all. Now I no more see matter as just one exclusive term of spirit somehow becoming matter. I see the matter itself as a subordinate position of mind, of spirit, in one continuity. You see, one of the characteristics of the later Vedantic terms which saw the world as illusion, or even those philosophies or religions which see the world as domain of suffering or ignorance and therefore somehow darkness to be rejected, in all of those somehow spirit, consciousness, liberated state, divinity are cut off from matter. If you attain the matter, if you are bound in matter, you do not have the true divine consciousness, you do not have the liberation, you do not have the nirvana or the absolute. If you have the divine or the nirvana or the absolute, matter is now irrelevant or just a domain of suffering and has no meaning in relation to it, except something to be gone through as long as it's there. The two are cut off, no link in between. But now, from the poise of the divine Purusha, you'd see matter no longer as a separate, sole, exclusive term of the spirit, but as merely a subordinate value in relation to the higher terms of mind and spirit. All of these are in a continuum. This is on a lower grade, but all the others are equally other grades, and this is only part of that continuum. And the result is, it increases by that diminution instead of losing its value. Now, because it has become a lower grade of the higher consciousness and all the in-between stages in a continuity, somehow it is more important. In what way? He'll explain. We see that our material being, life, nature are all one poise of the Purusha in relation to its Prakriti. And that their true purpose and importance can only be appreciated when they are seen not as a thing in itself, but as dependent on higher poises by which they are supported. from those superior relations they derive their meaning. And therefore, by conscious union with them, they can fulfill all their valid tendencies and aims. Now you get a glimpse of it. What is the they here? Material being, material life, material nature. This is material being. I am a material being. Life is our interaction between us as material beings. So our material life. And then it is formed of the substance of matter, which is a universal material nature. So now these three things, material being, material life, material nature. What are these? They are only one poise of the Purusha in relation to its Prakriti. My consciousness, the Purusha, entering in relation to my nature. There is a whole range of gradations of nature within me. My mind, my emotions, my body, the gross physicality of it and its animal instincts, the higher, finer grade of physicality and its subtleties of sensations and perceptions. All of these are the full spectrum of nature. And what I call my materiality is only one special relationship of my inhabiting consciousness with my nature. It's one grade, one focus, one density of a whole spectrum. But I cannot see this in exclusion. To understand this, I have to know my relationship with other gradations also, isn't it? Because this is one part of that full spectrum. Again, to take an analogy, if you look at light and the spectrum of light, let's say, from its lowest frequencies that we can see of red to its higher ranges of violet and even beyond. If I were simply to focus on the red and say red is bad because it is so meaningless, so pointless, so dull, so dark, cut it off. What happens to the rest? Well, one by one I would cut them off also, because left to themselves in isolation they would have no purpose. But it's only one relationship I have set with this range of color. What is my relationship with the full spectrum? And even beyond the ultraviolet there are ranges of colors where I have set the relationship of invisibility. I choose to be able to not see it, but it is still there as part of nature. So there's a full spectrum in which we see material being, life and nature are only one poise of Purusha in relation to its Prakriti. And the true purpose can be appreciated when they are seen not as a thing in itself, but as dependent on higher poises by which they are supported. So there are other relationships, other gradations. And to truly understand this, I must know the relationship with everything. Which supports this? Matter could not be possible, or my relationship with material things would not be possible if there was not life inhabiting them. I can value this as a flower because there's a life energy that is working to make it a living flower. I can value another human being because there is a mind animating his life and the thoughts which he shares. In fact, increasingly as human beings, we value a person for their thoughts, for their ideas, for their creativity, and even their ideals. This person has such a deep, high ideal and is always trying to live that. So a certain grade of humanity will say, oh, he's just a dreamer. But when you grow a little higher in consciousness, you'll say, this person is more precious than the other fellow who calls himself practicalist. Because the practical will always remain stuck with what life is. The dreamer is the one who's conceived the future and struggled to realize it, to make the impossible real. And so in my mind's value systems, these higher things are what make a person valuable for me or for the future of humanity. And his body, his physical life, and my relationship with him in physical body and physical life, and even in generally in nature. The human being is the most valuable form of life or even form of matter because precisely of the mind that inhabits which is self-conscious and can do so much. So the value of matter is in terms of all those things with which I have different relationships. And if I see the full spectrum, matter now has a very different value. So it can only be appreciated. Their true purpose and importance can only be appreciated when they are seen not as a thing in itself, but as dependent on higher poises of my relationship with nature, by which they are supported. Because there is mind and life working in matter, this has a different value. From those superior relations, they derive their meaning. And therefore, by conscious union with them, they can fulfill all their valid tendencies and aims. So when this material consciously unites with these higher gradations, all the tendencies, not only of the material form and life, can be fulfilled because now fulfilling the higher purpose, working through them, but the higher gradations which have their own purpose can be fulfilled when they unite with the material. The flower becomes flower when the idea of flower enters matter and works to fulfill itself. This flower becomes this extraordinary, sensitive, beautiful thing when the soul consciousness enters into matter and brings its beauty into the material form. And now suddenly you begin to see the importance of matter. It's the field where all those higher ranges of realities and experiences, or my soul, my Purusha relation with those higher gradations of nature, can find their high completion in the materiality. And therefore, by conscious union with them, they can fulfill all their valid tendencies and aims. In my mind, I have this ideal. What if this was possible? And it's an idea I have. And it will remain an idea forever, unless that idea can enter in relation with matter, material life, material nature, and can enter and complete that true relationship. That means the idea now finds a way to realize itself. Now, which is more precious? An idea floating with matter remaining separate, or an idea fulfilling itself in matter, continuing to exist as an idea, but now also realized on all other levels, down to the most material. Therefore, by conscious union with them, they can fulfill all their valid tendencies and aims. Life then becomes justified to us, and no longer stultified by the possession of liberated self-knowledge. You see, in the earlier experience, when you had the liberation, life became now dull, meaningless, barren, empty. But now from this integral realization, the integral liberation, life is justified. And the difference was in the way we perceived life from the higher consciousness. And now Sri Aurobindo, this is the 4 paragraphs which I said, they go in extreme detail, and we have done a kind of a quick summary of what Sri Aurobindo has described. And now he describes what happens next when you have thus entered in this liberated self-knowledge and you relate to life in this way. What is the experience like? First he says what it is not, and then he says what it is. So, this larger integral knowledge and freedom liberates in the end and fulfills our whole existence. When we attain to this integral knowledge, which has been the description, the theme across a few chapters, and the freedom, which is also integral, when we reach to that, in the end, it liberates and fulfills our whole existence. Not only we are liberated in a part, but we are liberated in all our parts. Not only are we fulfilled in one band of consciousness, but in all of our existence we are fulfilled. When we possess it, we see why our existence moves between these three terms of God, ourselves and the world. Remember that earlier he had said that we have to know the unity of these three powers, God, nature and self, individual self, and their intimate necessity to each other. So in this integral knowledge, we see why our existence moves between these three terms of God, ourselves, and the world. It's a very interesting suggestion. Our existence moves between these three terms. What does it mean? In a certain poise of consciousness, in this liberated consciousness, I am one with the one self, the divine. But also, I am an individual consciousness, a focal point in the whole universe and nature, which is also me. So there's a poise where I am that, which is the origin of it all. There's a poise in which I hold the whole of the universe in myself, all nature is within me. And then there is a poise where I am inside that nature as a focal point of action, even as I embrace all nature and stand above it as its origin. And so it's as if we move between these three. Our existence moves between these three terms of God, ourselves, and the world. We no longer see them or any of them in opposition to each other, inconsistent, incompatible. Nor do we, on the other hand, regard them as terms of our ignorance, which all disappear at last into a pure, impersonal unity. So he's telling you what it is not now. Remember, in the old way of looking at it from the consciousness of ignorance or from the liberation which came with a limited perspective, we saw them as in opposition. World is not God. Nature is ignorance. Individual is contrary to universe. It's cut off from the universe. Individual is not God. We saw them all cut off and opposed to each other. If this is there, the other cannot be there. If this is fulfilled, this cannot be fulfilled. When God is fulfilled, universe has to disappear, extinguished into oneness of God. If individual is fulfilled, then it has to oppose itself to universe. If universe is fulfilled, individual has to disappear because it must be flattened into universe. And so they were always somehow inconsistent, incompatible, opposed. Or the idea was, if we find at last the pure impersonal unity, all these are only terms of ignorance which should have disappeared. The world itself should cease to exist. Individuality should cease to exist. How else do you attain pure impersonal unity? And all this now changes. We perceive their necessity as terms rather of our self-fulfillment, which preserve their value after liberation, or rather find then only their real value. Very interesting idea here. When you attain to this integral knowledge, the integral liberation, we see their necessity as terms of our self-fulfillment. That is, if I have to, from this liberated consciousness, if I have to fulfill myself, these are the terms by which I will fulfill myself. When I am in the consciousness of the one divine, the divine moves to manifest himself in all his possibilities of what? Whatever he can be. All his self-experience. I can be flower, I can be bee, I can be gardener, I can be scientist, I can be artist. And they all move to manifest. And their interrelation forms this whole domain we call nature. And within that, I enter the experience as individual in order to fulfill myself. So God is fulfilled in nature and individual. And as individual, I am fulfilled when I recover my divinity because that is my true individuality. I am fulfilled when I experience all nature within myself as power of myself, because that is the truth of my relationship with nature. If my nature was cut off from me, there is no fulfillment. If I am cut off from God, there is no fulfillment. If God is cut off from nature or individual, no fulfillment. So you see the perspective changes. We perceive their necessity as terms of our self-fulfillment, which preserve their value after liberation. As I attain liberation, I see now nature and individual and God still as valid terms. But now, the subtle shift. Or rather, find then only their real value. It's only in the liberated consciousness I see the real meaning of individual, real meaning of nature, a real sense of God. We have no longer the experience of our existence as exclusive of the other existences which make up, by our relations with them, our experience of the world. In this new consciousness, they are all contained in ourselves and we in them. So this is a profound insight, and we appreciate it after the discussion we had. Earlier, we used to experience our existence as exclusive of the other existences, and it is this exclusion which makes up our relationship with things and our experience of the world. I am separate, my next door neighbor yogi is separate, those people at the foot of the hills are separate, and that's how I define my world, and that's my relationship with the world. Everything is cut off and separate. But now I no more experience it as exclusive and separate. What do I experience? That next door neighbor yogi is myself struggling in a different experience, in a unique approach and path of awakening, as are these others struggling in their ignorance also to awaken, as is the mountain, as is the valley, as is the tree, as is the flower. All of these are myself in a large movement of fulfilling, awakening, growing. So in this new consciousness, they are all contained in ourselves first. Everything is in me, in my completeness. Second, and we in them. When I look at the lotus, it is myself that I see in lotus as lotus. When I see the person out there struggling in his difficulty, it is myself that I feel intimately within him in that difficulty. Where earlier, remember, the ego tendency was to assert by exclusion its separateness. That's now gone. Instead, you have a sense of inclusion. Everything is within you. Equally, you are within everything. They and we are no longer so many mutually exclusive egos, each seeking its own independent fulfillment or self-transcendence and ultimately aiming at nothing else. That was the old picture, where the bee was seeking its fulfillment, the flower seeking its fulfillment, and each one of us in our space, the mountain is fulfilling itself by being mountain, separate and separate and separate. But no longer are we so many mutually exclusive egos. What are we? They are all the eternal, and the self in each secretly embraces all in itself and seeks various ways to make that higher truth of its unity apparent and effective in its terrestrial being. And so what we are seeing now is a picture extremely beautiful. First, all are the eternal, capital E, the same one divine who becomes the flower, who becomes the bee, who becomes this and each one of us. The self in each secretly embraces all in itself. Now the self within the flower embraces the bee and the mountain and the world, even as the self within me embraces all these as myself, but secretly. Within the liberated being, it is overtly. Now I am conscious that all these are myself. I am in them and I embrace them in my oneness. But within the flower, the same self I see, it is the same self. Secretly it holds everything and embraces everything. Because secretly the self of flower embraces the bee, secretly the self of bee embraces flower, therefore bee and flower are in some relation. If the self within flower says there is no bee, they cannot have a relation, isn't it? The fact that in the universe there are so many relationships, all relations are in a sense a partial revelation of the secret embracement of the self in each with all others. And so he says, they are no longer so many mutually exclusive egos, they are all the eternal, and the self in each secretly embraces all in itself and seeks in various ways to make that higher truth of its unity apparent and effective in its terrestrial being. So, because the self of bee embraces the self, because it embraces the flower, self of flower embraces secretly the bee, they are trying to somehow express this embracement. And it takes the form in the bee that it looks at the flower and it feels drawn to it. Oh, here is something so delicious smelling, so beautiful, so attractive. And as I go and smell it, I feel this great joy. What's happening? The self inside the bee has embraced flower and is trying to make apparent, to draw out in form, in appearance, that secret relationship of oneness. Equally, the flower feels the presence of the bee and it gives its nectar as if, because that's the way it tries to express its relationship, or secretly the self within tries to reveal its relationship to the bee through that gesture of giving itself. Sometimes it takes distinct physical forms. In many flowers, at the core of the flower, where the nectar of the flower is held, or the pollen is held, which it wants to share with the bee, to guide the bee to that place so that it may not be lost elsewhere, the flower actually produces a distinct color. But that color is part of its special relationship with the bee, not its special relationship with the human. So the color is such that only the bee can see it and not the human. From our human eyes, that color is ultraviolet, therefore invisible to us. We look at the flower and we see one color across the whole. But when the bee looks at it, it sees the ultraviolet. It says, there's a special focus inside. That is somehow attracting me. You see how beautiful the picture is? In everyone, secretly we find it is the same one self embracing everything else and trying to reveal bit by bit, more and more, make apparent that secret relationship. And the more that secret relationship comes forward and emerges, the more we see the complex forms of interrelations, interdependence, or even we will say an emerging expression of unity. The unity which is actually secret and concealed, where everything seems to be separate, begins to come out more and more, becomes more and more visible. So I reread this sentence. They are no more mutually exclusive egos. They are all the eternal, and the self in each secretly embraces all in itself and seeks in various ways to make that higher truth, the higher truth of the embracement, of the unity. to make that higher truth of its unity apparent and effective in its terrestrial being. And all this is taking place in the domain of matter. The truth is already felt in the deepest spirit. In the domain of matter, it is being made effective. But he uses two words, make apparent and make effective. And there are degrees, there are steps. The first step is to make aware, make obvious, make visible that there is this relationship. And then make effective when the relationship now begins to act, to build and fulfill itself. You will see in nature complex kinds of interdependence. There is a particular sea anemone, which is a very powerful poisonous sting, by which it stings the fish that comes close to it, that touches it, and stuns it in an instant, and then the anemone closes, takes the fish into its belly, digests, and then throws out the waste. But if the anemone is sitting just like that, the fish will recognize after a while that's a poisonous place, avoid. It won't work. Eventually the species learn. And so there's another fish, I think it's called the clownfish, which has a special relationship with the anemone, and in a relationship where the anemone will not sting the clownfish. The clownfish is somehow not only immune to the poison, but it comes and rubs itself against the anemone, and the anemone says, oh yeah, this is a friend, I don't sting it, I won't eat it. How does it know it? And then, when the clownfish is wandering around in the anemone, other fishes come and see this clownfish. Oh yeah, that's a safe space, let me also enter. And as they come in, the anemone stings it. And eats, digests, and the waste that it throws out is eaten by the clownfish. Interesting. The clownfish by itself cannot go and hunt. If it wanders freely, it will be eaten up by others. It has no way to protect itself. But when it is with the anemone, not only the anemone's poison protects the clownfish, but it gets it the food to feed. And the clownfish feeds the anemone by becoming the attractor for other fish. And you see such a beautiful relationship between them. I think the dog also wants to share in our enjoyment. But you notice everywhere in nature, this secret embracement, this secret unity is what makes possible all these complex relationships. And first it takes the appearance, we see something connecting this, some kind of dependence. But over time, the dependence becomes more and more overt until it becomes so deep that as in this symbiosis, one couldn't exist without the other. When you look at a forest now, and a rich, dense, complex rainforest, there are so many levels of organization of life. In the soil biome, there is an interdependence of feeding each other. The roots of the trees reach down, not only they draw food, from deep below, the big trees draw up food, but in drawing it up, they also share it with the shallow roots of the smaller trees. But they entangle into each other. It's a very beautiful picture if you look at it truly. The roots spreading out much farther than the tree's size. And the roots of the other plants and trees also spreading out, they entangle into each other in an embrace, in a complex web of embrace. Impossible for the human experience. We have only 2 limbs to embrace. And perhaps a few fingers we can interlock. But they have 1,000 or 1,000,000 fine tendrils which can touch each other and embrace, support, give solace, even nourishment, and share between each other. They even share knowledge. So if you have, for example, a hill full of the trees, on one side of the hill, the trees are attacked by a particular pest which starts eating the leaves, In this interlocked embrace, in the roots of the trees, the message quickly goes, I'm being eaten, and the kind of pest that's eating me. And what we see is on the other side of the hill, the message is got, and the tree says, the pest is coming, and they start releasing a poison specific to that pest. Amazing. You can no more see each tree as separate. You can only see them as one continuum of life. And yet they are individual. And what's the relationship to each other? In that embracement, they are not only nourishing, they are conveying information, protecting and helping each other. And this is just at the root level of the biome, under the soil. Take a step further up, and you find complex life systems, little snakes, lizards, centipedes which move on the surface. They can't go inside easily. And they have their own life system there. You go up 1 or 2 feet and you find a different life system where they cannot come, but those other beings exist there. Higher up in the branches you have the monkeys. They can go up and down, but their primary life is swinging from branch to branch. And right at the top, the leaves opening out to take the sunlight. And when you look at the way it is done, it's not one giant leaf that covers up everything and takes all sunlight. It's many small leaves allowing light to penetrate all the way down to the floor of the forest so that others also can share. And the fact that there is a tree not only draws up water from below, it also nutritionalizes the soil, changes the character of the soil through the leaves set, making the mulch which makes the soil rich and living for smaller plants which couldn't turn it into mulch or bring up the nourishment. Everything is intimately, intricately related to everything else, overtly dependent. Now, when a scientist looks at this first level of understanding, yes, we see that there is a kind of a dependence, they need this and so on. That's your textbook knowledge. But when you now look deeply, not in the view of the mind that saw the surface, body and body function only, when you look more deeply to the life energy and even the mind consciousness and their interdependence, what you see is something so much more beautiful. And if you look one more step, you see in each one of them the same self. First of all, the same eternal taking on each of these forms, the same self in each one of them embracing all the others, and that unity making bit by bit, nudging in little small steps, making the unity apparent and effective. And when it is effective, you see this complex interdependence working out. There was an example of how this can be broken. When human beings came into the Amazon forest, they cut a highway through the forest. And within a few years, one side of the forest began to die out. And so investigating further, they discovered there was a particular species of insect which used to migrate every year from one side of the forest to the other. Migrating to the other side, it would pollinate the flowers and then move back to this side. Because of the highway, the migration cycle was broken. They could not cross the forest floor. Pollination on the other side of the forest stopped and the forest began to die out. One simple cut was enough to break this complex interdependence. Of course, if you wait long enough, the underlying self within says, now I have to include the highway into my interdependence. I have to include the destructive human tendency into my interdependence, and it starts correcting for it. How? You notice everywhere. Recently, if you look at a hill, maybe you're all familiar with the Arunachala mountain, Ramana Maharshi's ashram being based there. When he first came to the hill, it was fully covered in forest. Dense trees. Not only animals would live, but even lots of sages, because it was a sacred space. By the time he left his body, it had been completely denuded, was barren rock. Why? Because human beings cutting trees for firewood and for rearing goats. And the goats are one of the most destructive creatures for this purpose. They not only eat the leaves, they uproot the plants. Unlike cows who nibble the surface, the top of the grass, you'll see they nibble a little bit there. They never damage the underlying life. But the goats come with a very forceful, stubborn aggression. They pull out and uproot. Everything dies. And so within a couple of decades that he was there, all life there became barren. What do you see now, before the human beings began trying to replant? Nature says, all right, now I have to include this human being and his aggression and the goats, and it starts growing thorny bushes, thorny trees, sharp, stinging, painful when you come in contact with them. And obviously, the goats cannot eat those. Human beings don't find it very useful as firewood. And that becomes the first level of response of integration by which life recovers, pushes back. You'll see in desert, if you keep cutting forest and turning it into desert, after a while you find thorny bushes, cacti, all sharp-edged, hard, no juice, no burning value, but extremely resilient. And they form the first response of life to rebalance and bring up the unity, which makes possible the next level of response where tiny plants can grow under the thorny bushes, which have the protection of the thorn, and bit by bit eventually all the forest would try to come back. But in the way this underlying sense of unity works, whatever you throw at it, it tries to include, it tries to organize itself to work together. They are all the eternal. And the self in each secretly embraces all in itself and seeks in various ways to make that higher truth of its unity apparent and effective in its terrestrial being. And the fulfillment is in matter, in the form. Now comes the most beautiful summary of this. Not mutual exclusiveness, but mutual inclusiveness is the divine truth of our individuality. You see, now the whole picture has been reversed completely. Where in the beginning we started with this idea that an individuality means, and the ego imprint was, I exclusively separate myself from everything. I affirm my independence from everything. I am separate, you are separate. Each ego became not only exclusive but mutually exclusive. If I own this, if I exist, you cannot own this, you cannot exist. And so naturally in my liberation, I have to extinguish all else. If my liberation had to be complete from that perspective of a non-integral knowledge or a non-integral liberation. But if the turn of the awakening in the yoga has been from the beginning the integral knowledge, or if having first liberated yourself in an exclusive focus, you re-embrace the world now from an integral knowledge, then the whole relationship has changed, not mutual exclusiveness, but mutual inclusiveness. But the sentence is longer. Mutual inclusiveness is the divine truth of our individuality. And if so, I am an individual. My individuality is fulfilled when I include all other individualities. But there is no abolition of my individuality in the liberated knowledge, in the integral knowledge. And then he says, love the higher law and not an independent self-fulfillment. So instead of mutual exclusiveness, you have moved to mutual inclusiveness as the divine truth of individuality. What is this relationship of mutual inclusiveness? Essentially recognition of the one in the other and the giving of one to the other, which is the love. And so love is the higher law and not an independent self-fulfillment. If you look at the ascetic paths, what is happening? Each ascetic withdraws, fulfills himself independently. At the very first step, you withdraw from the world to fulfill your liberation, leaving behind the world exactly as it was. In fact, worse off, because the one person who had the access to higher consciousness just withdrew and said the world is false or illusory. Who's left to help us now? Poor guys. If this one person who had access to the higher knowledge recognized that the others are myself, and he includes them in his liberation, or recognizes that they are himself struggling, he brings that power of his higher liberation to help others or share in their life. And now he is so much more worthwhile, an individual center for a divine consciousness to reveal and assist the larger awakening of others. So the relationship is love is the higher law and not an independent self-fulfillment. So you see the model of the cave, and in each cave a separate aspirant to his own liberation. And at best we meet, perhaps we have to share food or some other facility, but each one is following their own thing, has no more the same value. If I recognize the other is myself, and that underlying secret and truth, now more overt, has not only to become apparent but effective, then obviously within our separate selves there has to be an interdependence or sharing on the basis of love and not independent self-fulfillment. Immediately there is the sense of a collective sharing, growth and even fulfillment. And that's why in the integral yoga, where the whole goal is this integral fulfillment, integral realization and liberation and divinization, you do not have a separate isolated yoga of withdrawal, you have rather the fulfillment in a collective life. And the base of the collective life becomes extremely important. But from a higher consciousness, not socializing, not your shared economic and political interests, which are perhaps at best a support to begin with. But from a higher consciousness of this insight, we relate to each other as each a conscious soul, a spark of the divine, a divine being, each struggling to grow out of their limitation, their incapacity and ignorance. And as each grows, there is a mutual support and sharing in that collective space, which makes for a divine society. Deva Sangha in Sanskrit. Deva as divine, or the word div as the root of deva is light. Devas are light beings. Sangha is the coming together in mutuality. So Deva Sangha is the divine coming together in light, in awakened consciousness, or a divine community. So the summary of this discussion, not mutual exclusiveness but mutual inclusiveness, is the divine truth of our individuality. Love, the higher law, and not an independent self-fulfillment. Again, of our individuality. That means as our individuality comes into its own true character, it becomes mutually inclusive. As the individuality grows into its deeper truth, love is the law of its relationship with all. Now this completes that part of the discussion where we skimmed over the 4 paragraphs where he went into the whole logical theme. And as you can see, it would have been difficult to cover this across a few sessions because the ideas build in sequence coming to this fulfillment. Now from this fulfillment you go back to what we had just read. With the new consciousness, what happens? When we attain to this integral liberation, we continue to live and act through our individual birth and becoming, but with a different knowledge and quite another kind of experience. Now you've seen what that experience and knowledge is. The world also continues, but we see it in our own being and not as something external to it and other than ourselves. To be able to live permanently in this new consciousness of our real, our integral being, is to attain liberation and enjoy immortality. And what that feels like, we have had a first glimpse. Sri Aurobindo now quickly summarizes this from the larger discussion we have had of the relationship of the individual consciousness, the Purusha, with nature. And there are some important conclusions. So we will read part of this, but we will explore it in greater detail next time. The Purusha, who is our real being, is always independent and master of Prakriti. And at this independence, we are rightly seeking to arrive. Now look at the big picture from the journey of our initial egoistic consciousness to this true awakened individuality. The common theme is that your center, I, is trying to enter in relation with my nature, my thoughts, my emotions, my body, my tendencies. And the relationship it's trying to assert is of mastery. I should be the one to choose what thoughts I have. Emotions should not seize me and take me off track. I should be able to freely feel what I choose to feel. I should be able to act without limitation of my body and its dullness or incapacity or whatever. So always the Purusha is trying to arrive, rightly he says, seeking to arrive at the mastery of Prakriti. But in our real being it is always master. In our false being it is not master. That is the utility of the egoistic movement and its self-transcendence. And if this is the impulse of the evolution, you realize why the egoistic tendency was so important. It helped to assert, to say, I will dominate my environment, my circumstances, my nature, even my own body and mind, in order to bring it back into its true relationship, which exists up there in my true I, but which does not exist in my false I. So in the first movement, as I come into my own, I have to try to replicate or realize that truth, but by limited means or even false means. So he says that is the utility of the egoistic movement and its self-transcendence. But its right fulfillment is not in making absolute the ego's principle of independent existence, but in arriving at this other highest poise of the Purusha with regard to its Prakriti. So if you want to fulfill the ego truly, it should be by bringing back that true relationship of the Purusha with your nature, rather than, which would be the wrong way, which is to make absolute the ego's principle of independent existence. Saying, I am separate from, I do not depend on, and by my independence somehow I am able to overcome and be free of nature. When I am unable to change my environment, I find, let's say, the noise of the city too disturbing. What do? I am independent of this. I withdraw, go into the forest. I have asserted my independence, I am free of the noise. But the same thing we do with our own body. I am unable to overcome my body's incapacity. I step back and I declare, I am independent of my body. It doesn't matter what its limits are, I am free. So you will recall the poem which Sri Aurobindo articulates in his sonnets. It's worth reading from this context. And the poem is titled It's titled Self. He said, I am egoless, spiritual, free. Then swore because his dinner was not ready. I asked him why. He said, it is not me, but the belly's hungry God who gets unsteady. So you see the independence of the ego saying, it's not me, so what, that's nature. Cutting off. I asked him why. Why is the belly's hungry God getting unsteady? I asked him why. He said, it is his play. I am unmoved within, desireless, pure. I care not what may happen day by day. I questioned him, are you so very sure? He answered, I can understand your doubt, but to be free is all. It does not matter how you may kick and howl and rage and shout, making a row over your daily platter. You see the idea, your nature can do what it wants, it's nature. I am free within, unmoved. And then he completes, to be aware of self is liberty. Self I have got, and having self I am free. And so Sri Aurobindo nudges the idea that, well, something is wrong with this. Taken to its logical conclusion, it even accepts all kinds of unstable behavior. If the inner consciousness is free, it does not matter what your nature does. And obviously that is not acceptable to us. But that would be the practical result of the wrong fulfillment by fulfilling the ego's principle of independent existence, where the Purusha steps back and says, I am free of nature, nature can do what it likes, I am free. But what should be done instead? But in arriving at this other, higher poise of the Purusha with regard to its Prakriti, where it is master already, and Prakriti is its free, spontaneous expression of the will of the Purusha. There is transcendence of nature, but also possession of nature. At the same time, the Purusha is free. At the same time, he completely possesses all Prakriti, is freely expressing. Perfect fulfillment of our individuality. You notice, your individuality is not fulfilled as long as in trying to do what you want to do, you find your nature blocks you or turns you, or in doing this you have to compromise with some other part of your nature. How can you be fulfilled? You have to be free from nature in order to fulfill. You can't be formed by nature or dependent. On the other hand, as you try to fulfill yourself, if nature does not follow what you want, again, you are not fulfilled. So nature should not compel itself on you. You should be free of nature. And at the same time, nature should obey you and you should be able to flow freely in your nature. Then you have the true fulfillment. So, there is transcendence of nature, but also possession of nature. Perfect fulfillment of our individuality. But also perfect fulfillment of our relations with the world and with others. So in this poise of the integral knowledge, the same relationship which we have with our own nature, we have also now in our relationship with others, where also we are entirely free and yet able to relate from that freedom as we choose. And at the same time, we have the perfect fulfillment also of our relationship with the world, where we are free of the world and yet are able to exercise ourselves freely in everything in the world without saying this is not good, this is inferior, this is somehow trapping me, binding me, or a domain of ignorance or inconscience that prevents or blocks. So the full freedom and the full expression of its freedom in mastery. So, perfect fulfillment of our individuality, but also perfect fulfillment of our relations with the world and with others. Therefore, an individual salvation in heavens beyond, careless of the earth, is not our higher objective. The liberation and self-fulfillment of others is as much our own concern. We might almost say our divine self-interest. You see, if you are to enter that liberation and you experience yourself in others struggling in ignorance, what do? You obviously reach out to help yourself. To what? To share in the same liberation. But it's yourself that you're helping. So it's a kind of, he says, a divine self-interest. As our own. So not only is it our concern, the liberation and fulfillment of others is as much our concern as our own liberation. If my liberation is my first priority, equally the liberation of others is equally my first priority, because it is my own divine self-interest. Otherwise, our unity with others would have no effective meaning. Effective meaning, key word is very important. You have the unity with others, but is that unity effective? Then only you can say, yes, this is unity. He concludes this, describes 3 stages of overcoming. To conquer the lures of egoistic existence in this world is our first victory over ourselves. Remember, we start with I want, I need, I crave, the egoistic existence demands, and you find satisfaction for a while in it. But to conquer that, it's a lure, it pulls you, gives you kind of a seductive attraction and satisfaction until you realize it's not really truly satisfying. So you overcome that. So to conquer the lures of egoistic existence in this world is our first victory. Over what? Over ourselves. I feel like I am compelled to, although I know I should not, or it's not helpful. I know I'm going to suffer tomorrow. I know I'm going to regret, but I can't help. It's so attractive at this moment. So in overcoming the egoistic lure, you have overcome yourself. So that's your first victory over ourselves. But there are 2 other victories waiting over ourselves also, which he will now highlight. To conquer the lure of individual happiness in heavens beyond is our second victory. See, having come to this poise where I have overcome my egoistic attractions, the next attraction is I will enter this exalted state in heavens beyond, and I will attain to individual happiness in a heavenly state of consciousness. And that's very attractive. To overcome that is your second victory. And wait, there's a third one. To conquer the highest lure of escape from life and a self-absorbed bliss in the impersonal infinity is the last and greatest victory. The lure of wanting to absorb yourself in something which is even beyond life, and you get rid of that trap. It's a trap luring you into something, however seductive, but it is not something which is complete, not the truth or the highest truth of your being. Then are we rid of all individual exclusiveness and possessed of our entire spiritual freedom. And the implication of this is staggering. He says, as long as you're trapped by those lures, including the lure of transcending and withdrawing from all life, you are still bound to the exclusiveness of the individual, and you have not attained to the full spiritual freedom. Amazing. Amazing as an insight. We would not have perceived it. The yogi who chooses to withdraw from the world and says, I am entering liberation, has not entered a true entire spiritual freedom unless he has overcome that attraction. And equally the yogi who withdraws from all life in self-absorbed bliss, if he has done that, although he seems something so extraordinary, his spiritual freedom is incomplete. And he is still bound in the exclusiveness of the individual. And the true freedom of the individual will be when it is no more exclusive, embraces the world, and attains to those states of consciousness in the world, fully engaged with the world, experiencing everything and everyone in the world as himself, participating in each of these interactions to gradually bring forward, make apparent and effective this true unity. And that means the yogi, even as he ascends to that greater freedom, will constantly strive to make apparent and effective this underlying relationship of the unity in everything, with everyone. What form that may take may depend entirely on that individual turn, that individual form of his consciousness. It may be through a very mundane appearing activity. We have an example in the Bhakti traditions of a potter who was a self-realized being. And it taught with the symbolism and vocabulary of the materials of the potter. He would knock someone's head and say, this is still unbaked. Meaning you need to bake yourself in the tapas. But that was his way of participating in the world through that activity, through that form, in that relationship. Another may be in the form of a scientist. And he begins to explore and reveal and assist through that particular modality. Another may be in the form of an artist who, as his consciousness is more and more liberated, is able to express deeper and higher truths through the art and engaging in different ways with different beings also at the same time. Another may choose to be in the middle of the forest and relate through the forest with the forest first. And it will not be because he is shirking from, but it may be the particular stamp of his individuality in his relation with the world, with nature and other individuals. Then are we rid of all individual exclusiveness and possessed of our entire spiritual freedom. And Sri Aurobindo always takes through till the end to make perfect everything. You've attained to a freedom from individual exclusiveness, you have attained to spiritual freedom, but it's not perfect until you've overcome these three lures, attractions. And so each time when he concludes something, a description, he defines the criteria by which you know it is made perfect. And until it is made perfect, it is not done. And this is one of the very important statements he makes right at the beginning of the synthesis of yoga. I don't quote, but the idea is that until it is perfectly done, it is not done. And of course, everything in all aspects must become perfect. And so that's why, if you look at the big picture of what we aim to realize, it is so complete, and therefore we may even say the most difficult in terms of what it conceives of, what it seeks to realize, but also the most fulfilling, the most perfect, the most complete. But precisely because it is what is attained by the effort that you make, in relation to the effort that you make, what you realize is so much greater that he says it is also the easiest yoga. It is the most difficult in the goals that it sets, but in terms of what it realizes for the effort made, it is the easiest. The ascetic who makes a huge effort to cut off and withdraw from the world, the energy that he puts in breaking out, in withdrawal, 1/10 of that energy would go in fulfilling in an integral realization with an integral knowledge, perhaps. Because it was not cutting off. All the energy lost in cutting off would then be utilized in the embracement, in the awakening and in the embracement. If you think of it in these terms, it is also the most easy, but also the most fulfilling and therefore complete. So we will, the next paragraph, the state of the liberated soul is that of the Purusha who is forever free. And what is the nature of that consciousness? And the embracement of the divine love and delight around all creatures and so on. That becomes the theme of how he lives in what relationship with things. So all of this we will take up next time, which will be Friday after a gap of 2 weeks. Unfortunately, I have to be out of station on the 8th, and on the 15th I would come back, but not in time. So we will continue this on the 22nd of March. For now we can pause on this, and if there are any quick questions or comments. What a beautiful vision he lays before us, not only of the nature of reality, but also of the nature of the true sense of liberation and knowledge.
It's studying God, nature, and ourselves, which we are just discussing. And we just understand it, whatever he says. But to understand really as what is ourselves with God and how we are connected, is there any means and methods to practice for that?
Yes. So at the very least, with this understanding, you begin to look at everyone and everything differently. Although I may not be awake in myself to experience that underlying unity, in the part of my mind now which knows the truth of this, I begin to realize this truth. And automatically it changes my relationship with all and with life. No more is it acceptable to withdraw. No more is it acceptable to become exclusive. But my spiritual development includes my participation in life and the growth of all equally too, in whatever form naturally may be relevant. So first of all, in a very practical level, it changes everything. Second, it changes your relationship also with God and with nature. Now everything in nature you see not only as it appears to the superficial mind, but you now try to make an effort to look more deeply. What is the presence within? What is the direction of its development? What is the path of its evolution? How do all these things relate? You begin to see and feel more deeply. Not only with human beings, but also with things, with forms. If you are working in the garden, or if you're cutting a highway, you will look at those trees, you will look at the place of your highway more deeply and work in a way that will embrace rather than cut. So everything changes if you accept this not just as an idea, but as a practical reality that your consciousness, wherever you are, mind, heart, emotions, deep or superficial, wherever you are, you embrace this truth. It changes your relationship. More deeply now, as you concentrate to feel the divine presence within you and work to practice in awakening to a deeper and higher state of consciousness. At each step, from whatever poise of consciousness you have, you will turn upon the whole world and all beings. And now begin to recognize that this which you have glimpsed in yourself is also present in them. Although their surface mind may not be conscious of it, but it is that. And the more deep it is within you, the more you recognize it is the same in that. So at the very least, as a mental creature, I look into each person and I see each one has a conscious mind. The way I think, they also think. Maybe in a different way, from a different perspective, with different values, but their thinking and their perspective is as valuable to them as my perspective and thinking is to me. And I will not simply dismiss another saying, oh, you are wrong. I will say, if they are seeing something, there's a truth to that. I'm seeing something, there is a truth to this. I'll begin to relate more deeply. When my consciousness goes deeper than simply the thought and I glimpse the sense of a divine presence, not just within me, I make effort to now glimpse it in every form and every being. And as I feel that, however vaguely or however deeply, my relationship with them is on the basis of that deeper insight. First and foremost, in this child, what I see is a conscious soul evolving. First and foremost, that I see in this adult is a conscious soul evolving. And how do I relate to each one? And now you see, the relationship is of a much deeper order. I will be as respectful to the child as to that elder. But in a different way, as respectful, but the relationship would be different. I will as respectfully assist this child in awakening as I will assist the elder in his struggle to manage his physical life, or in learning from him whatever wisdom I may receive. So, at each step of our journey, at every step of our own growth and awakening, we will re-embrace the world from this deeper insight, changing the quality of our life, lifting it and deepening it step by step towards that divine life which will be the fullness and completion of it. And going back to one more key insight, the physical world, the material world, in fact has now an extraordinary importance. In a certain sense, a greater importance than the other worlds. Because all those worlds now fulfill themselves in the material domain. And if I see more of ignorance and suffering now, it is only because we are in a process of awakening, and at each step we will now assist that higher reality, that higher truth, that higher world or consciousness which is trying to manifest, to come out more and more in things around us as much as in us. So you see, on a very practical level, the whole orientation changes, all your priorities change, and the nature of the sadhana, the progress of your spiritual journey, undergoes a fundamental shift. We will close with this. Dwell on this theme, dwell on this vision and its full implications over the coming weeks, and you'll see how it changes your relationship with all things. And for this correction, for the correction of the error even, or the limited experience of so many past traditions and realizations, spiritual paths and religions, we have to be grateful to Sri Aurobindo. Otherwise, all we had was fighting viewpoints, fighting contradictory experiences, never seeing each other, never able to meet, except by a kind of a grudging acceptance. All right, you also have a spiritual experience, but somehow mine is more true. And then the Pope did that a few years ago. He said, all right, we will finally accept that there are other ways to God, but ours is more special, more superior, more whatever. Okay, I see that. I've been in so many inter-spiritual meetings. Inter-religious it was, then they called it inter-spiritual because religion was somehow not so hep, so they called it inter-spiritual. But in practice, it was always implied in the discussion or sharing was this, somehow mine is more special and I can nourish myself with a few things from yours. But what you see here is something which completely transcends all these exclusivities. And there is nobody, no philosopher, no spiritual teacher who has formulated or even experienced this truth. And when formulated in this way, it's so simple, it's so obvious, and so deeply satisfying, and radically changing of life and our relationship with nature. And so we have to be grateful to Sri Aurobindo. Good question. Isn't that our kind of superiority? That's why I said being grateful to Sri Aurobindo. He shows you something which has been missed by the greatest minds of humanity. And he shares it to you in a way that is so complete. But you are grateful for it, you do not feel superior for it. It is an insight that eventually should be shared with all by all. And that's what he has done to us, and we should hold with all. One may feel a sense of superiority that I am trying to practice something which is more complete, but that's just your little ego. And it's a temporary passage of its growth. But rather the correction made right at the beginning in the way you relate to things will prevent you from the error of being stuck in an exclusive spiritual experience. And therefore be able to transcend the ego in an embracing, inclusive realization. Yes.
Was it said in the agenda of the mother in 2023, Sri Aurobindo, every word collaborate.
Yes.
It's not so far.
Yes. Yes. So in gratitude to Sri Aurobindo and the work done by the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for humanity, for the divine.